Okay, let's get started. Today I'm going to be talking about our experiences with a React monorepo setup. The talk is titled "From Proof of Concept to Production and Beyond, and Pain Points and Learnings from a React monorepo Project." First, we are going to go over some background on the company I work for, then on me, then on the project, and then finally we are going to get on with the monorepo. So, I work for a company called Alma Talent. We are part of this Alma group. We mainly publish content for professional audiences and special interest groups. We have magazines and websites from doctors to those interested in the stock markets. We have also information services where you can buy data about companies and real estate business, and we also host events and trainings. I mainly work with that publishing part and with the websites, not with the books or magazines. My background is mainly in front-end programming. I have been mainly writing React and React Native, and mostly React Native nowadays. I have been working here at Alma Talent and its predecessor company for the about last 5 years. And you can find me in Twitter with that handle that even I can pronounce correctly. Okay, some background on the project. The first commit was made in the first half of 2017. The project currently has about 14,000 commits and 30 people have been contributing to it. The project has about 165,000 lines of code if you don't count the SVG files, which add another maybe 30,000, 40,000 lines. The project started out as a site renewal project for one of our websites. We had 6 websites that were running on this old archaic CMS system that also handled the front end. We didn't have we had some kind of version control, but it was very, very rudimentary. And we mainly had to work with Apache FreeMaker templating language and JSPs. Okay, so the decision was made to make a proof of concept project and try to remake the whole thing. We got a clean slate, so we got to choose what technologies to include in the project. The first site went live about 6 months later. It was a site called Talouselämä. It's one of our it's our financial weekly, and the last one couple of years later, about exactly. And eventually the project grew into a monorepo of 10 media sites. And one thing to keep in mind is that these sites differ in scale quite a lot. So the smallest ones have maybe tens of thousands of page views per week, and the largest ones have millions. And the project wasn't started with the monorepo in mind. And there are some goals there. We wanted to make it more maintainable, search engine optimized, and platform that could be used to renew those other sites as well. And we did. And when I'm talking about monorepo, what does it mean in our context? Well, it's one single repository that contains code that can be used to build, deploy, and develop 10 of our web front ends. So the scope is kind of limited. We are not mixing and matching front-end, backends, and code that isn't related to one another in the same project. So it's kind of a project monorepo, you could call it that. We didn't go with any monorepo library. There are those around, but when we moved our one site into the monorepo project, we take a look at what was out there. One of the most popular back then, and I think even now, is Lerna, and we kind of copied Lerna's file structure. So we have this packages folder that contains all the publishable packages, although we aren't publishing them into NPM or anything like that. And so we have 10 of those package site-specific packages, and then we have one common folder which contains all the code related to, or should I say, all the code that is shared between the projects that is directly related to React and its utility functions and things like that. When we had to add a new site into the project, I don't know if we made the right decision, but we kind of copied the last one we were working on, and then did some really hard search and replacing to make it the new site, and we have ended with this kind of weird family tree of sorts. But it's just you learn to live with it. Apart from those packages which contains the React related code, we also have other shared code here as well. We have AWS folder, for example, which contains our CDK scripts. We have bin folder, which contains some deployment scripts. We have tests, and so on. The whole project shares tooling, and also nowadays it shares a CI/CD pipeline as well. And CI/CD means continuous integration, continuous delivery. Okay, so we got the clean slate. So what did we choose, and how have they worked with monorepo? So for rendering, we went with Vue. Nobody laughed, but yeah. So we went with server-side rendered React with universal router. Back then, Next.js wasn't a thing, or at least it wasn't that popular. So we are using just vanilla React. And something about the universal router is that as we have our sites, although they share the same structure, their front pages, for example, do not share same components. So we have to fetch different APIs to be able to render those pages. So in the end, we have ended up with many router functions, and we have to keep them consistent with each other manually. So we aren't gaining any helps from the monorepo there. For type system, we went with TypeScript. It was kind of a cost of a toin between TypeScript and Flow back then, and I think we choose the right one, because nowadays TypeScript seems to be the de facto way of writing JavaScript. And because typing can be really hard, type definitions are a pain, especially if they're really complicated. And with the monorepo, we have to do them only once, so it scales really well. And one more thing about the TypeScript is that when we change something, so type definitions changes, for example, for some API response, the TypeScript compiler tells which code lines we have to change in order to get it compiled again, so that's nice. For styling, we went with styled components, and because many of our components have styles included into them and they are heavily styled, it can be a bit annoying to work with them if you want to share a component, because they are heavily styled. we are using theme files, so each of our packages have their own theme file, and it helps a bit because you can just import the theme file everywhere in the project. And because we have done some tricks with the TypeScript compiler options, it knows to pick up the correct one. For testing, we are using Jest and Test Cafe, and testing is kind of a must-have for this large project because it's easy to make changes, and with that it's easy to break things. And this is also a must in order to have that CI/CD pipeline. So you really can't have one without tests. We are in a point where we can confidently deploy into our QA and staging environments, but we haven't yet automated our production deployments. For building, we are using Webpack, and as I mentioned, we are doing some tricks with those compiler options, and Webpack allows us to do that. So same short imports can be used anywhere. For example, if I want to reference those theme files, they can be used in the packages common or packages kauppalehti, packages microbitti, from everywhere. For state management, we went with Redux, and it's almost as good as a scaler with monorepo as the TypeScript, because it's also code that you can, write once and then you can use it between all the sites. This also means that our Redux stores, the state tree is really similar between all of our projects, and this helps with getting new people to help out with the project, because if they know one site, they kind of know them all. And for server and infrastructure, we chose Lambda, API Gateway, S3, and CloudFront. And of course, for the backend, we have another services as well, but these are mainly for the front end. And I mentioned it here also because we are using the Cloud Development Kit script to make those. So if we want to make changes to our infrastructure, we just modify the script and then we deploy the same script with a couple of different parameters, and we can have all of our sites in the new infrastructure. And the CDK is Amazon's infrastructure as a code library, and we are using the TypeScript version. Some pain points. Component scope and reusability. Normally, when you think about a React project, you have components that are one-off components. Then you have components that are shared across the whole project, and you use them to make another components. When here, as we are using the monorepo setup, and we had that packages common folder, we now have a third level, and it's something that it's really nice to have, but it also complicates things a bit, because you have to think about when you are making a new component at where you should put it and so on. And if you have made a mistake and you have created this kind of a site-specific component, and now a product owner says that, hey, we want that same feature added to another sites as well, it can be a bit of a pain to unroot those components from those site-specific components and bring them to the shared components packages common folder. Because if it's a really specific feature, it can have some typings and styles that are not easily unified. Yeah, I kind of touched that second point already. Most of our components are heavily styled. How should we reuse them? And one solution could maybe be that you can always copy a component, or then you can make it a common component and add some props to it, so it could behave a little bit differently depending on which sites you were running it on. Our solutions, if it's used by more than one site, turn it into a common shared component. If it's going to be used by more than one site, make it a shared component from the start. If it has too many props, split it into multiple components. But with those shared components and with the splitting and with the props, you always run into problems. And one could always unify most things. We as coders, we like to keep things short and concise. But in my experience, that isn't always the best way. And I have been favoring even more lately code duplication over making it shorter, because when you duplicate code, okay, you get few lines of code more, but you get this kind of safety asset with it, because when you make changes, you know that it's going to affect only this part of the code. It's when you make changes to those shared components, you can break the whole thing if you don't know what you are doing. Okay, pain points, more sites, more complexity, and this could also read more X, more complexity. But when you are making changes to those shared components, they can break in unexpected places. For example, if you are developing some site-specific feature and you need to make a simple adjustment to one of those shared components that live in the packages common folder, you can end up breaking some other site that you weren't working on. And as we have 10 sites, when you make those changes, a lot of deploying is required. We are not using feature-specific branches yet, so we are having QA and staging environments and production environments, and we had 10 sites, so it means we have to deploy times 30. And how do you make sure that the improvements trickle down even to those smaller sites? Yeah, and our sites are structurally similar, but however, small changes are made to them all the time. This means that as the time goes on, they grow apart a bit by bit. So how do we combat that? Well, our solution to this has been, your common best practices, code reviews, definition of done, following processes, doing testing, and so on. And they have gained the CI/CD pipeline has really helped us out with that. So when we are making changes, and even if we are making those changes to just one site, our CI/CD pipeline takes this change and runs the tests against every site. So we can be somewhat confident that the change didn't break anything. Okay, so what have been the pros and cons in our context? Well, the sharing of code between the sites becomes really easy. Your visibility into the whole project grows because you're not splitting these sites into multiple repositories, and you can just check out the whole thing and make changes across the board. And our way of doing monorepo has kept the sites relatively similar. And one of the pain points was that how do we keep those sites up to date, even those smaller ones which have tens of thousands of page views per week that don't get all the attention they maybe deserve. But when we are running this monorepo setup, for example, if we need to upgrade some library, we can just upgrade the packages and make all the necessary changes across the board with one pull request. So they kind of get some updates automatically. One of the pluses have been if you have worked on one site, you know how the whole project works because it has shared tooling, deployments, tests. And one of the cons is that although the sharing of code is really easy, you now have to think how you are going to do that, because you can shoot yourself in the leg if you do it the wrong way. Also, the ability to break more things grows if you are having more and more code in that is shared across those sites. And then maybe a minor thing, but we have had some editor problems. One silly thing is that when you have been looking code for hours and you have multiple copies basically of the same file that only differ in the name somewhat, you can be editing the wrong file, and and it can be a bit frustrating to notice that. There are some Visual Studio Code plugins, for example, that can help out with that. They can, have regexes based on your current path that, for example, color some parts of the editor. So when I'm editing Kauppalehti, I'm seeing red, and when I'm editing some other site, I'm seeing blue, and so on. So it's instant feedback. And the fast jumping between code sometimes breaks. I think it's because of those compiler options that change. And the monorepo, although it has been good, it doesn't help with scaling. Other scaling needs, complexity still needs to be dealt with. And for example, we have had testing holdups because we are now running this CI/CD setup, and if there's a change, if there's some test that is failing for no apparent reason, the whole thing doesn't get deployed. We have scripts that can be used to deploy those anyway, so it's not that big of a deal, but it's just a thing to keep in mind. Okay, in conclusion, our limited scope monorepo has worked very well for us, and I think that any difficulties we have had would have been worse if we would have had multiple different repositories. Ability to make changes across projects has been key in keeping all of those smaller sites up to date as well. Shared tools get new developers up and running quickly, and type definitions and Redux code scale like hell. Also, we haven't had any kind of problems with version control. That was one thing that I came up when I was searching the internet, that's what other people had to say about monorepos. Yeah, I guess that was that. So thank you. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, the question was how often we have been breaking things in production with this setup. In the early days, somewhat. Nowadays, less so. That CI/CD setup that I kept talking about, it helps out with those breaking changes. It catches a lot of problems. Of course, our testing helps with that also, but just transpiling the TypeScript code for every site, it helps out a lot already. So there was a question.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, I was wondering that are you seeing some behavioral patterns happening with the architecture of different sites then? Like, are you noticing more of the mutations that you mentioned earlier, or are you also seeing evolutionary steps being taken that, okay, you get benefits coming from one repo, or like one of these sites coming up from there? Are you noticing one or the other more, or are you just noticing both of those behaviors?
I think we are noticing both, and of course there are best practices that are discovered, new ways to do things, and that was one thing I mentioned about those family trees, and because, for example, Arvopaperi is kind of a child of Kauppalehti. It has most of the benefits of that Kauppalehti's code base. So, and it takes an effort to then go through all of the other sites and make those changes, and it can be laborious. But as we have this monorepo set up, it's at least possible, that we could unify, make them the same way.
How could you not make multiple bugs in one single step when you're like a novice developer?
Yeah. Of course, when you are starting out, the first changes we often ask them to make are some smaller changes that are site specific. So you are not going to be touching those these common components from the start. So that's one thing. And when people are familiar with the setup, then they are allowed to make changes into those as well. But one thing to mention is that I ran some numbers, and it was about 12% of the lines of code live here in the packages common. So it's, most of the code lives elsewhere. So you aren't likely to make multiple bugs with one change. Together, it's something. The packages common has about 20,000 lines of code, and the whole thing was about 165K.
Yeah, about the shared components. Do you have any guidelines or best practices on defining and designing the APIs for those? Because I think that might be one of the main things. If you get the API of the component right, then you're likely to have it used.
One of the things we have been doing that when we are making any kind of a function that lives in the project, we prefer to pass objects down to it, because with objects you don't have to care about the ordering of the parameters, and it's a lesson that has been learned with bit of a pain.
Feel free to ask.
So this question is about the writing the interfaces for the APIs in the TypeScript. So for example, if you have one interface which has 5 parameters, and that interface is going to be used in 2 components, and other components, they need like 6 parameters, or sometimes one is optional in there, and for the other component it's required, so you have to relax your interface there. So is there any way that you found a solution to this problem?
In TypeScript, it's possible to extend those type definitions, so that can be one way. But I think we have been using just, if it's a component that takes some props and it lives not in the packages common, I think they have their own type definitions for props, for example, and mainly the type definitions that live here in the packages common, they are related to Redux actions and reducers and our API typing the responses that we get from our APIs.
Yeah, I guess that's it.
Yeah, that's
One big applause for Niko.
Yeah, thanks.